I think there's been not quite as much imagination as I would love to see around how the humanities can benefit. What can we do with computers alongside us where these differences are not something necessarily just to be reacted against, but they may be something good? We ought to be confident that theology has something to offer here. And I also think we ought not to damage that confidence by speaking unaptly or inaccurately about technology.
Welcome back to Faith at the Frontiers. This is part of our series on AI, and in this episode we're asking questions like, what makes human beings unique? This is a question that theology has asked for many centuries, but the rise of AI and LLMs has forced us to ask it in a different way and with greater intensity. But also, what can AI do to help the common good for humanity? We can be very aware of some of the ethical problems and challenges that AI brings, but what are some of the positives? And to help us think through these questions, we've brought with us on this episode Dr. Lyndon Drake, who's a research fellow at Oxford. He has two PhDs, one in AI and one in theology, so he's the perfect person to help bring theology and AI together, and also think about what theology and what faith in general can do to help AI, rather than the other way around. All of these things we'll explore in this episode, so enjoy. AI is changing our society in ways that we can't fully predict, and higher education is one of the fields affected by the rise of LLMs, but there are many other fields. What we really need is Christian experts to think through the implications of AI from a faith perspective. And that's why the University of Oxford has founded the Oxford Collaboration on Theology and Artificial Intelligence, or OCTI for short. And it's a great pleasure to welcome one of OCTI's research fellows, Dr. Lyndon Drake, on the show. So, Lyndon, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
Would you care to share a little bit about your background and what sorts of expertise led you to take this position at Oxford?
So I've got a slightly confused background. I wish I could pretend that there was an intended narrative arc for my life, but it's actually not true. So I had the immense good fortune to, in 2000, have the chance to move across and work in investment banking, where I worked as a software developer in 2000, at the start of 2000, having grown up in New Zealand. And while I was working in investment banking, I did a PhD in artificial intelligence at the University of York, which is up in the north of England. And so I spent about 10, 12 years largely in investment banking, and had this parallel track where I did artificial intelligence. Not the cool
I see, but the investment banking was
always
always from a programming and software perspective.
Well, that's what I started off in. And then I had the chance to join a trading desk, and I thought, why not give it a go? What could go wrong? I mean, obviously there's quite a lot that can go wrong with that, but, it turned out that I enjoyed it. It went pretty well. And I didn't really use the programming in my day-to-day work for quite a few years. So I was often the bridge between the trading desk and the software developers. So that was my sort of first bit of adult life.
Wow. And then you went on to study theology.
I did. So we'd been involved in church life in London very actively for a long time. And after the financial crisis, I was feeling a little bit worn out, I have to say. And maybe I should have just taken some time out and stayed as a banker. But, I decided to retrain in theology and really work towards going into church ministry back in New Zealand, which was where I'd grown up. And so I came across to Oxford and did undergraduate theology here, which was both wonderful and an immense shock to the system.
Quite different from the world of software and finance, I would imagine.
It was, that's right. Yes, it's quite a big difference. And I guess I got used to life running a particular way, and having to learn again and not be good at things again was, I'm sure it was good for my character, but it wasn't good for how I felt at the time.
Makes sense. And so all of this led up to you being the perfect person to do research on theology and AI, having that background with a PhD in AI and then a PhD in theology.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. Though my PhD in theology here at Oxford, I did the doctorate in Hebrew Bible. So I still had this interest in in economics and the Hebrew scriptures and what they say about it. But it's then led, after years of ministry in New Zealand, we've moved back to England, back to Oxford, and have the chance to try and bring these two things together, serendipitously or providentially, depending on your point of view.
Yeah, and you're part of a very exciting new team at Oxford that's researching AI from a theological point of view. Could we start with just some basic orientation questions? We're mainly focusing on LLMs, large language models, in this podcast, just because that seems to be what everybody means by AI now. Although when you did a PhD in AI, there weren't any large language models. So could you talk a little bit about that evolution of AI from the kind of stuff you were working on up to what everybody means by AI now?
Yeah, I mean, people go, oh, you were doing AI back then. Did it even exist? And then I tell them that there was the first major conference on AI was in 1956 at Dartmouth University, and it was really mind blowing. So, but you're absolutely right. In popular discourse, when people say AI, what they mostly mean is chatbots. Strictly speaking, not even a large language model, but a chatbot that's built on a large language model.
Okay.
And there's this sort of a trope within AI science that once the scientists figure out how to make something work, people go, oh, well, it wasn't really intelligence after all. So people use AI all the time, every day, but typically don't think about those things they use as being AI. And I wouldn't be surprised if in a few years' time, chatbots are in the same category. But for the moment, they're 100% flavor of the month. And that's because they're doing some very cool things that we used not to be able to do. And computers were notoriously bad at some of the things that large language models seem to do very, very well.
Yeah, we had somebody on the podcast earlier who compared it to the sort of shock effect of the feeling of magic. Like if you took somebody from ancient Rome and brought them into the modern day, a lot of the technologies that we have would seem to them like magic. And he was saying that we all had that sort of effect with these, with ChatGPT and Gemini and all of these, is that because it's so new and so unexpected, some of the things it can do, it felt to us like magic.
I mean, I have to say that's how I felt about AI. I've been involved in AI for about 30 years now, and I've had that feeling for a long time about many other things, but mostly they're quite geeky things, and so it's very hard to convey to somebody else just how magical it feels. But language we have this instinct that language matters to us as humans. And so when a computer starts to get good at language, it makes us feel differently, or it makes a broader group of people feel the same way that I feel about other more mathsy things that are happening.
That makes sense.
So, I guess I'm really curious to know about the sort of kinds of conversations that this group of researchers is having about sort of theology and AI. Is there a sort of center to the kind of discussions that you guys are having these days?
So we're really fortunate to have a John Templeton Foundation donation, which enabled us to start these conversations. And one of the key things that we wanted to do was to attend to those things which are present day realities. Rather than, I think sometimes there's this temptation to try and look into the future. Turns out we're very bad at doing, especially with AI, but really to attend to those things that are present day realities. And one of those present day realities is the fact that this development in AI technology is affecting the majority world and drawing on the majority world in ways that we felt have probably not been sufficiently attended to. And so we've given a real focus to that. I mean, it's from Oxford, we're sort of the definition of the cultural West, but, we're at the same time trying to make a significant effort to engage well. And we also really wanted to attend to the breadth of people who do AI practice. There are tens, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people working in the AI industry. And most of them are not Sam Altman, thinking grand ideas about, how the world might change. They're doing probably a mundane job. And we've also exported, and these two things intersect because we've kind of exported some of the bits we don't want to do in the rich world to the majority world. So there's often this very dehumanizing labor of tagging content, especially objectionable or offensive or illegal content, and that's hidden labor that's been moved away. So all of this meant we wanted to have a real focus on listening to people about the ethical concerns that they have and encounter, more than the sort of the grand eschatological side of things.
Yeah, that's, I think, a really helpful kind of practical focus. That also reminds me of the, so many of these companies that have been touting AI for a while, we've then discovered were just actually people on computers on the other side of the world. And so someone said, the computers are supposed to be pretending to be humans, but it's often humans pretending to be computers when we say AI as well.
Which is just crazy when you think about it. So the degree to which hype outpaces development is truly insane. And a lot of the robotics companies, they say we've got this robot and it's doing stuff, but there's somebody with, controlling it frantically in the background. And so all of this. And at the same time, there are these incredible advances that you just couldn't have made up. And both of those things are happening at the same time. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it requires some careful, nuanced thinking. And we've seen this on some of the previous episodes. We've had somebody who was very clear that there's nothing magical, or AI doesn't have suddenly consciousness or personality or anything like that, that there's nothing really radically new about it, but at the same time that there are things that are very new and new challenges to society and that kind of thing. And we need to think through those differences.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably a little bit less confident that we don't have things like consciousness or sentience, partly because we've often used those as coded terms for things we don't quite understand about how humans function. And one of the really fascinating things at the moment is we're also making, I say we, it's not me, but scientists, neuroscientists especially, are making really significant progress in understanding some of these aspects of being human that until recently we didn't really have a firm sense that they were embodied phenomena. So I've mentioned particularly here the work of Sanjay Manohar, who's a neuroscientist here at Oxford, and he's also working on machine learning, because what he's finding is there's a real overlap in machine learning functions in a very different way from human brains, but at the same time we're making discoveries around human brains, and there's an interaction here with machine learning science that's proving very productive for understanding both.
So there are sort of comparable ways that the human mind works and the way LLMs work, even if they're not quite the same. That's sort of what you're saying.
Exactly. They're very, very different from each other, but there are certainly some very interesting similarities. And my personal point of view is that whilst there is undoubtedly an immaterial aspect to being human, that the phenomena that we associate with being human are also wholly embodied. So by that I don't mean that there's no immaterial aspect, but what I mean is that we can now observe enough to say with reasonable confidence that, for example, things like desires, orientations of the heart, spiritual experiences, that all of these things have an embodied component that's very substantive and which tells us a lot about how humans function.
So they're built into our sort of physical nature as having bodies.
100%.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's interesting. Yes. You're using a very interesting word there, immaterial. You're avoiding words like supernatural or the soul or spiritual. You're just saying that there's something about the human being that is not fully exhausted or completed by our physics.
Exactly. And obviously that's a theological belief, but what I really want to guard against is a sort of God of the gaps, or a theology of the gaps that says there's these bits, this ever narrowing sphere of what we don't know about how humans function, and we're going to ascribe the soul to that bit. What I want to do is to say, and it's a theological assertion, obviously I can't prove this, that there is both the observable embodied phenomena within our brains and as well an immaterial correlate with that. But what I want to then do is to also guard against the assertion that there are certain competencies that are not accessible to AI systems. Because and this is partly a technical prediction, having just said, you can't do predictions about AI. But
well, we can't avoid it entirely.
No, well, I mean, it's part of the fun of the whole thing, right? Guessing what's next. So, my view would be we're probably human competencies in every domain are likely, certainly within our lifetimes, I'd say, to be exceeded by those of machines. In the same way that our physical competencies have long been exceeded by machines, but it's less troubling to us, I think, to say that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, on the one hand, I think the anthropology that you're saying is quite traditional, right? This is throughout the kind of Christian tradition, we have typically said that we have souls with powers that are embodied in physical organs, and the intellect is the power that's not embodied in a physical organ, but the way that it functions is always in working with those powers that are embodied in physical organs, such that any one thing we do, there's always a sort of physical component to the thing that we're doing, but it's not that doesn't exhaust the sort of the reality of what humans are doing. And I mean, I guess, I'm a little bit curious to say, like, is it just that, like, individual component parts of things that humans can do, you think these could be replicated? Is there something about sort of the whole that is sort of unique to humans, or is that something that you think is also kind of on the horizon in that sense?
Well, I mean, it's very much conjecture, but my instinct is that it is in theory possible to build an analog of a person which is indistinguishable in a substrate. Now, we lack the technical capacity to do that right now, and just as one of the technical obstacles, our brains compute or think, or whatever we want to call it, on the basis of very low power consumption compared to computers, and we don't really know how to bridge that gap. And the way the individual units of computation happen, in a big neural network, are very different from the types of individual bits of computation in a human brain. But I don't see an in principle objection to that, either theological or practical. And I'd very much want to reach back into scholastic theology for many things, but I think the emphasis on rationality and the location of the intellect in the soul is probably something I'd want to question. By the way, all of these things, I would say we're all talking about things that are within the existing bounds of Christian tradition and theology. And that's one of the really fascinating things for me about this. I think there's a chance here to invite people. Tech people often think they're the very first people to have encountered these cool questions, as a really sort of naive sort of positivism about, and we're like, no, we've been talking about this for a long time in theology, and you may wish to encounter the tradition before you come out. You're very, very good at the neural networks, but you're not the first person to have thought about this.
And theology has a long tradition of thinking about what it means to be human and what is distinctive about being human.
Yes. Yeah.
That brings a lot of resources to these questions.
Completely. Yeah, and is contested within theology. So that's this is the big point. I want to bring people into that debate rather than them arriving at a conclusion. Now, of course, in the popular Christian world, and I'm not sure that people would necessarily, they'll typically be located within a branch or a twig of the tradition, and theological anthropology is a contested space within Christian theology.
Perhaps one of the most
and I locate myself. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's right. But there's also, there are other areas that have impinged on this. So, think about disability theology, which has really pushed back on the scholastic idea that rationality is what marks out the image of God. And
though, of course, that's not what the scholastics mean by that.
Interesting.
They're talking about use, not rationality. But yeah, the caricature has been pushed back on quite strongly.
Well, we don't need to have that argument right here.
Well, it could be quite fun.
Well, I guess it's slightly relevant. I mean, I guess one of the things that the AI raises is exactly what it is about human beings that makes us in the image of God. That is not true of AI and computers. And you're just suggesting that certain conceptions of rational ability or the ability to process information in a sort of rational way, because AI is showing its ability to do that, we can no longer attribute that solely to the human.
Or, as some Christian AI people are doing, they're saying, well, we ought to then ascribe the same moral value to these machines because they exhibit the same characteristics and competencies.
So I guess what you could go the other way on that.
Yeah, no, I very much go the other way on that. So, I mean, if anything, I would say this is probably the biggest divide between, certainly what I think of as the mainstream of the Christian tradition, which says that we are distinct and unique and tools are not like us. We might not know quite how to say that, but we don't think tools are the same, even if they're very powerful tools. But many people in the tech industry, certainly outside the Christian world, are very much disposed to ascribe moral agency and patiency to these machines, these artificial systems. And in popular fiction, for example, that's absolutely the mainstream. Now, I'd say within Christianity, a lot of people, I think, then lack the theological resources to say why they might disagree with that. And so there's a tendency even to do the same thing within parts of the Christian tech world, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I mean, the idea that human beings could create robots that then have sentience, consciousness, free will, goes all the way back to the 19th century. It's one of the earliest kind of science fiction tropes. So that's not a new idea, but I guess the question has suddenly become more pressing now that AI can do things that it couldn't do before.
And the question of, right, like, it's not surprising that the things we create bear a likeness to us, right? But is that a qualitative or a quantitative difference? And what does that mean theologically and as you've raised, the question then is, well, what are we? And you're right to say that theological anthropology, philosophical anthropology impinges on that, and a whole range of scientific disciplines, cultural, political, ethical questions. Which is why I think this is a helpfully sort of, insofar as AI is sort of also giving us another layer to that, to ask these questions well. And one thing that I'm struck by is that you've said, I think some people that were earlier in this series, they said something like, AI isn't consciousness or isn't human because human consciousness is embodied. And I thought that was a strange claim, because I think that AI is embodied in the sense that it is a physical mechanism. And you've sort of said the question is there something about being human that is not necessarily fully embodied, or is that's kind of the
not material? Not material. You said it was fully embodied,
but
you
not
said
fully
it's not
material.
It's not exhaustively understood by its embodiment.
Yeah, which
Exactly.
That's how I would think about it. I thought that was helpful, but I wonder if have you noticed that sort of divide as well in terms of how Christians are talking about this?
Oh, completely. And I think there's this weird, as well as the tendency to try and look ahead and guess what will come next, there's also, I feel, a little tendency to go, I observe that this, such and such a thing like consciousness does not pertain right now to AI systems, and then to go, and therefore it never will. But I'm not really sure about the chain of reasoning there. In fact, I'm very skeptical about that chain of reasoning. And so, and I've seen people say, AI can't be creative. Well, I think we're getting to the point where it really, it's indistinguishable from human creativity. I mean, the number one country and western song, certainly last week, was entirely AI generated. I mean, a much, much lower bar, the number one contemporary Christian music song, also AI generated. I mean, I'm talking about aesthetically a lower bar here, which has not always been the case, but at the moment I'd say that's fair. Anyway, you take my point. It's a jolly good simulation of creativity if it's... I don't know how people have defined creativity to exclude those.
Well, I mean, it's it raises very important questions. Funnily enough, my wife is actually doing a research project on creativity right now and asking the question, is there something about human creativity that makes it radically and ontologically different from creativity in AI? But the research project's not over, so there's not a clear answer yet. Yeah, but it's great to have you on the show, because many of the people we've interviewed so far have been quite negative and skeptical about AI and see mainly the challenges, the ethical challenges, and the dangers to what higher education can do. You're offering a slightly more optimistic, hopeful point of view here, but I'm sure you're very aware of some of the ethical concerns raised. Yeah. What do you see as some of the major ethical concerns? We don't have to spend tons of time on this, but
no. But I think a lot of this depends on on that theological anthropology question, and just to put my cards on the table, I would say that the distinctiveness of humanity comes primarily in an ordered sense from God's designation of humans as bearing his image. So it's a rare moment where I'm more Bartian than but I also think there's enormous resources here in scholastic theology, for thinking about things like participation and mediation, tool use. So Andrew Davison, the Regius Professor of Divinity here, has written about tools. All of this. There are resources there to help us think about that. And I think they orient us towards the goods that come and also give us then a way of reasoning about the risks and dangers. So, for example, if we accept, as I think the scholastics argued, that tools form us as well as being used by us, that might alert us to the possibility that there's a formative process taking place when we use, when I use ChatGPT, it's changing me as a consequence. And I think we can be alert to the dangers while still attending to the constructive possibilities. So a colleague on the project, Sarah Lumbreras, who's a professor at Comillas University in Madrid, has talked about looking for those things where our cognitive offload can be constructively formative rather than destructively formative. So, we all do. There's books in the background of all of our camera images here, right? So that is a form of cognitive offload compared with orality. And we've gradually figured out, I think on the whole, how to make that cognitive offload a constructive and beneficial aspect of being human.
Can we just break down a little bit what is meant by cognitive offload here? You're talking about something that saves time and intellectual effort, right?
So I no longer have to recall. I spent much of my time in New Zealand in the Maori community, which is a highly oral culture. I've heard of a person who recited from memory for 3 days without ceasing. It's an extraordinary feat of memory, to make no errors on. And that's probably that might be towards the limit of human capacity. But most of us would like to be able to have recourse to a wider pool of knowledge than is memorizable by ourselves. And I mean, maybe I'm trainable, who knows, but, I do not have 3 days of perfect recall, orality at my disposal. I've sort of vague thoughts.
Yeah.
There we go. And middle age, I've got to say, is really starting to eat away at this. So what I mean by cognitive offload is that in a different social setting, in a pre-written setting, there were feats of memory required to bring different threads together. With access to writing, we no longer need, and then printing, of course, accelerates that greatly by increasing the scale of what we can record and have access to. So, here in the Bodleian Library here at Oxford, I think they've got 15 million volumes. And all of those are the product, at the moment, they're all the product of humans. So, this is in some sense, the Bodleian, perhaps more than any other place on earth, has the collective textual output of humanity, if you exclude the internet. It's an extraordinary thing that I can, it's indexed, I can get at it in certain ways. What I'm saying is that AI systems are letting us do other forms of cognitive offload, just like they did with map reading, for example.
Yes.
That was a hard AI problem for decades, and we don't think about it as AI, but I don't have to think about how to navigate a map anymore. I don't particularly want to, It's good that some people do, but for most of us, I don't think we feel a sense of loss as humans from getting rid of it. But it's obvious with a chatbot that it's also eating into things that we think probably are important formatively. So what we need to do is make an informed decision about the goods that we want to achieve in formation from engaging with these tools, as well as being alert to the problems. So does that sorry, it's a very long-winded answer, but does that locate my sense of caution?
I just wanted to make sure we were going at a pace that everybody could keep up with. And I would use the example in academic research, 40 years ago, nobody had a search bar that they could type keywords into to find journal articles and books. And now that's available to pretty much every academic. It saves a ton of time that many people who did their PhDs back in the 80s are very envious of. But nobody is calling nobody is saying that we should eliminate the search bar because of the cognitive offload in your language. Everybody recognizes that this saves time in a way that can actually enhance and support creative intellectual activity rather than suppress it. And what you seem to be saying is we need to find ways that LLMs and AI can do the same.
Completely. And I think one of the barriers to that, or one of the bits that mitigates against the good outcomes here, is there's something around engagement farming, and that many of these systems are designed simply around keeping us involved with them, and that's probably quite bad for cognition. And some of the things that are least computationally expensive, so the things that the companies are most likely to offer, are also the things that again are cognitively corrosive, or they erode our abilities over time. And so Sarah Lombroso, in a talk she gave at Harvard that I was at recently, said we do actually know how to make these tools support and enhance and build up cognitive capacity, but it's harder, and we could replace harder by more expensive, maybe. So these are well understood computer science and human neuroscience issues. So we actually don't need research on this. We know what to do collectively, but it's expensive.
Well, and I guess the problem is there's less motivation to do it as well, because economically you'll make more money by producing AIs that are attention harvesting rather than AIs that drive you to think harder.
Oh, 100%. And also there's this whole thing around, flattery. So, I've had to change, I've had to put my own system prompt in because, ask it, what a wonderful question, Oh, that's very astute point you've made there. Yes. And, do we really need, is this the fundamental problem we've got at the moment, is a lack of affirmation here? I'm not convinced it is, but these sort of sycophantic versions of chatbots are, and again, this comes back to questions of theology or philosophy. Is what humans need is more affirmation for what we are, or is there some sense that our desires may be disoriented and maybe need a little bit of critique occasionally? These are important questions.
Yeah, and I think
so it kind of illuminates problems with the human condition that were already problems, but AI is sharpening our awareness of them.
But it also raises the question, I think that you said is not only a sort of cognitive science, but the ethical question of what is the purpose of cognitive load, for instance, right? And I think we recognize that we live in a society and institutions, think of the ref in the UK, right? They think the purpose of our minds is output. And so whatever makes you be able to publish more things, if we had people writing 10 times more books than they were, then that's the good. Whereas, in a kind of an older version would be the only point of the books is how they form the humans. And so how is cognitive load sort of shaping humans? I do feel like that's often, that's a view that's sort of almost universally gone from our society. And so when people ask these questions, they're just thinking what's going to make us more productive, usually for economic ends, right?
Yeah, and with a particular time horizon in mind. So, if we do accept there's some formation maybe happening, and particularly in higher education, you think this ought to occur to people, that we're hopefully doing something here that is not just about me getting a good grade or my institution getting a good review or lots of income. This ought to raise a different approach, or at least the question of whether we ought to have a different approach. So I won't name the university, but I saw one university which said that it's open season on the use of AI tools. And I'm at least, full credit to them that they've recognised they've got no way of checking or safeguarding against that. Once you've got an assessment model that includes non-invigilated assessment, then the moment all you're really measuring is you're measuring people's competency with a chatbot. And that's probably not what we thought universities were 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
Very interesting. That's quite an extreme approach. Most of the universities I know are not going that far. They're trying to use a sort of brute force forbidding, if you're caught using AI, then you'll be expelled or whatever. But I'm not sure how effective that's going to be in the long run, because it's just so hard to...
It's not effective in the short run. Yeah. You can't tell.
You can't prove it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so a couple of my colleagues, a colleague here at Oxford and at Hillsdale, have written a paper suggesting that we need to look at flipping the script a bit, using large language models to do what would once have been called a viva. So here at Oxford, they're still
an oral examination, right?
An oral examination, exactly. Yeah. And so they're not very scalable. We if you and I have to sit down for half an hour and talk through your exam script, I'll soon find out whether you understand it. But doing that for a lot of people is inherently challenging. But you can get people into an examination room on a secure computing environment and get the LLM to do it with 60, 100,000 people at once. That's very straightforward. So we
that's
prototyped
really
that.
fascinating, as you say, flipping the script. Everybody's worried about what LLMs will detract from our ability to assess things, but you're saying, well, why not use LLMs to actually find out whether a student has used an LLM itself to produce? Yeah,
that's right. They're not very good at teaching. At the moment, I wouldn't preclude them becoming good at teaching, but they're not that great at teaching at the moment. But they're actually, I was quite impressed with it. I mean, I just mocked up a fairly quick prototype, but it was good, and I would really. I think
tested it on one of your own articles, didn't you?
I did. That's right. Yes, and I did that partly because that's already included in the training data set now. So it didn't, and it asked very interesting questions that weren't, they haven't turned up in the literature. And I guess this comes back to, I think LLMs are doing things that are quite interesting. They're not, they can't be reduced to stochastic parrots, even though I love that way of framing them. And they are doing something statistical. I mean, again, I get that, but they're doing something very interesting as well.
Yeah. And I do think, I mean, one of the questions that this raises also is like, I think in the humanities, especially, like and this is the divide in the university, right? It's like in the sciences, if we're like, hey, LLMs are going to solve all these problems that we've been trying to figure out, then great, let them solve it. But in the humanities, that's not as clear. Like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? If these things could do the thing that we've been doing, should we have even been doing that thing? Right? Like, what is the point of all of this? I think and that's when one of the challenges facing some like universities is like, which of those sides are you going to go with when you think about how we engage these?
That's right. And I mean, I'm not convinced we have to pick a team. I think there's been, perhaps not quite as much imagination as I would love to see around how the humanities can benefit. And I can give a couple of examples, mainly because we've put in a grant proposal to see if we can get funding to do some of this stuff. So one of them in theology, a classic question is around hermeneutics. And, in certain circles we might talk about being wissenschaftlich, scientific-ish, or something, something along these lines. And certainly, I think we flatter ourselves that we're functioning in a very disciplined way here when we do exegesis and hermeneutics.
Objectively verifiable facts and all these kinds of things. Yeah,
that's right. Yes, the settled results of our discipline. And I think we could do quite a bit to interrogate that. And I don't just mean that in terms of critiquing the outcomes, but say you take, I mentioned BART before, and I must admit, I can't claim to really understand. I feel a bit baffled by BART sometimes, but even for those who have given considerable attention to his work, it's an enormous piece of work. I'm not entirely convinced that maybe even he didn't manage to hold it all inside his head in some sort of deterministic format. So I think it's interesting to look at the different capacities that a large language model gives us in that setting. Computers are good at holding a pretty large amount of stuff together in a coherent way, and that's potentially a good difference of thinking, computation, whatever, from a human. And I really am interested in ways of thinking about what can we do with computers alongside us, where these differences are not something necessarily just to be reacted against, but they may be something good. And you could draw an analogy here to medicine, where it turns out now that machine learning models in many areas of medical imaging are more competent than humans. And that seems to me like a really good thing. And it's partly because they can integrate multimodal information in a way that we just don't. We don't function that way, and we can't modify ourselves to do that.
And what makes that good, I guess, is because it's serving humanity. It's serving the cause of the common good rather than detracting from our humanity. And that brings me to one of the main outputs of the Oxford collaboration at the moment, which is this oath that you've produced. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And I guess we're going to wrap up soon after that.
Yeah, so this was an idea that a colleague of mine on the project, Joshua Horden, who's professor of Christian ethics and has worked in medical ethics for a long time, suggested that we ought to have an oath. And it turns out other people have also wondered about this. And it's partly by analogy with the Hippocratic Oath. And the Hippocratic Oath has functioned for quite a long time as an orientation for moral reasoning. And so what we've observed is, realistically, there's not going to be an international treaty because there's geopolitical conflict. And we don't have to name the great powers, but nobody's going to stop. So any sense that we're going to somehow draw limits at the sort of global level, I think is entirely naive, even if it's a good idea in some sense. What we wanted to say is that many people are involved with limited agency. So say you get employed by OpenAI, you don't get to say what the company does in its direction. You have very limited agency and actually limited awareness of the consequences of your decisions. And so we wanted to create something that attended to those people's work and gave them a sense of liberation within boundedness, which is very much a theological idea as well, that by having some boundaries to your moral reasoning and an orientation within your moral reasoning, this might then give you a way of thinking about your work. And we wanted to also say that we recognize that people's agency, even in voicing concerns, might be limited. And so we haven't said you have to do this or leave, but we've talked about the giving voice to your conscience and considering the wisdom of how you function within these environments.
Yeah, I really like some of the lines of this.
Oh, do you? That's good, please.
It's sufficiently general that it's not sort of pinning people down to very precise behaviors, but it says things like, I will embed appropriate truthfulness in my work and demonstrate honesty in how I describe my work, which seems like a very sort of basic thing. But then it goes on and says, I will orient my work towards respect for human identity, enhancement of human creativity, and support for dignified human work, which seems to me to be encapsulating this idea that if AI can actually serve the common good of humanity rather than undermining various things that we care about, then it can be used as a really positive force, right?
That's the hope. And I would say the big dividing line on this we found was between people who don't see a distinctiveness to humanity. So we wondered about doing something which was more generic in terms of ethics without privileging humanity. But in the end, we decided that this was a sort of line that we didn't want to cross.
I see. Very, 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 very fascinating. We can put a link to the oath in the text of this podcast. Any final thoughts in the last few minutes?
Well, one of the things we'd love to see happen is AI and theology really functioning within science and religion, and absolutely there's this point around ethics, but we think there's an interesting opportunity here for theology and science to go together in a constructive way. So if we take the cultural West as, in some sense, if you take Tom Holland's book Dominion as telling a story of the cultural West, as taking some of its givens from the Christian world, I think there is an opportunity to then backtrace a little bit here. So we say, we share a sensibility here. Not everyone is a Christian or agrees with these Christian theological points, but we also have a disposition that says we're concerned about the same things. I think within that, there are great opportunities to contribute to science from within theology, and it's not often we've had that chance. And there's also opportunities for some of that scientific reflection to feed into theology, and to help us as a discipline, speaking as somewhat of a theologian, and also to help us refine our theological ideas as well by just drawing these contrasts with artificial systems. So I'm very I'm very hopeful and optimistic about the space. And as a geek, I'm also just excited.
So I guess, because theology has for so long been debating what it means to be distinctively human and what the value is of being distinctively human, it now can offer something to the sciences, and the sciences can offer something back in a sort of mutually enriching relationship. That's really, really cool. And it does seem like a great opportunity.
Yeah, and there's other. I mean, I've talked about the scholastics a bit, but there's also more. There's more recent theological movement. So a lot of Catholic social teaching has a strong conception of the common good, and there's a lot of worked out thinking about how you might embody this, and I think that's really worth giving attention to. I think there's a lot of richness there. And we ought to be confident that theology has something to offer here. And I also think we ought not to damage that confidence by speaking unaptly or inaccurately about technology.
Very, very helpful. Well, thank you so much for these insights, Lyndon. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. It's just great to join both of you, and hope there's an occasion to have another conversation in the future.
Thank you for listening to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. If you liked this episode, then do subscribe to hear more like it in the future. For now, goodbye.